A month ago, one woman's neighbor, Aunt Linda's cousin, a handsome young man with brown hair, left home to become a soldier. Then Sam, the brother-in-law of Uncle Tom's friend's son, who lived in a small stone house in the village, packed up all his things and ran away from home, leaving a note, "I will be a warrior." The same house, a wooden table behind which a man and a small boy are sitting, very similar to him, probably his son. A woman with pink hair in a ponytail puts a plate of soup on the table. A man with shiny brown hair and yellowish eyes raises a wooden spoon to his lips and stares at the woman. She closes her eyes and tilts her head to one side. Suddenly, calm at first glance, the woman opens her green eyes and angrily says to the man, "What are you thinking about? Eat quickly." He replies, "Listen, Shirley, maybe I should become a soldier?" A woman drills a man with a displeased look. She does not like his behavior. "Daddy, take it away, what's wrong with him?" says the woman in her mind. The man scoops up a spoonful of soup and tells the woman to sit down to eat quickly. Otherwise, the dish will get cold and not very tasty. The woman thinks that he is still carrying some kind of delusion. This young man is annoyed that he is not listened to. He jumps up and bangs his fists on the table despite the presence of the child in the kitchen. The man shouts, "I'm serious!" At the end of his brief tantrum, he places his hand on the table, closes his eyes, and smiles smugly. The woman, on the contrary, is just starting to get angry. "And this is my husband?" The man's mood changes dramatically. He leans over to his wife and cheerfully says, "You know, I almost caught a wolf today." The woman closes her eyes and disinterestedly asks, "Wolf?" A man hits his chest with his fist. "I feel like a previously hidden power has awakened." The woman laughs skeptically. "It definitely wasn't a wolf." A man is offended like a child when he realizes that he is not believed. "It was really him. I heard you, wolf howl. I don't think I messed anything up." The woman leans on the table and angrily replies, "What wolf in his right mind would come to the farm in broad daylight? This is some nonsense." Yes, her patience could no longer hold. The man puffs out his cheeks, so he looks a lot like a cocky turkey. He swallows the soup and says, "Even if you don't believe in me, I will still be a good warrior." The woman is burning with anger. "I wonder how?" The man's eyes sparkle. Of course. He triumphantly raises his hand with the spoon in the mountain and enthusiastically says, "I will participate in the contest for the selection of knights." The woman is shaking with rage. She even has thoughts of killing her husband. He and his stupid dreams already bored her. How much will this man act like a child? "Baby?" The woman remembers that there is a child in the kitchen, so she tries to calm down. She puts her hand to her forehead, wiping away a bead of sweat, and says, "No, Shirley, keep calm." The woman takes one of her hands in the other, trying to cool down a little. "George, please stop being delusional. This is completely unreasonable." Shirley begins to explain why she thinks this. "If you get to the capital, we will." The son of these two people is sitting on his chair and listening attentively to his mother. He starts to blush and his eyes open wide. It seems that his parents' quarrel made him sick. A woman asks her husband how they will live on. He just turns away and covers his ears. The boy shivers. Shirley finally pays attention to her son. The woman falls silent. A second later, she cautiously calls out to the boy, "Brandon?" The child is really shaking from fear and emotional tension. The boy turns to his mother. His big green eyes, like hers, are full of tears. That's when he bursts into tears. Brandon tries to say something but can't. And suddenly the child bursts into tears. Children's whining can be heard even from the street. If the family had neighbors, they would have been worried and definitely visited this poor, unremarkable house. Shirley hugs the boy and says reassuringly, "Our sweet baby, it's okay, stop crying." Little Brandon snuggles up to his mother. The woman stares at the man. Her gaze is full of annoyance and hatred. It is because of this poor warrior that their son is now choking on tears. Shirley clears her throat. "George!" The scream is so loud that the man closes one eye and hurries to cover his ears. Yes, his wife always had a loud voice. The woman tightly hugs her already slightly calmer son and measures her husband with a displeased look in her green eyes. She gets up and goes to the room, asking her husband to clear the table while she puts her son to bed. The man looks at the two small wax candles in the middle of the table and the full plate of soup opposite. His wife didn't even touch the food. George sits on the chair for a few minutes, then gets up and walks away. It seems his wife got him and he's not going back. Time passes. A tired Shirley, who has been soothing and rocking little Brandon for a long time, comes into the kitchen and says, "He cried so suddenly. Maybe out of surprise? George, because of you. George, I am everything." And then she notices that there is no one in the kitchen but her. There are only 2 plates of soup on the table, full, her, empty, her husband. Shirley calls George. No one responds. The woman is angry. "Did you go somewhere in the middle of the night again? Didn't even wash the dishes after eating? I asked you." The answer is silence. Shirley finally realizes that something is wrong. She opens her eyes wide. Here she sees a piece of paper on the table, on which is written in George's crooked handwriting. "Good luck to you, Shirley." A woman takes a note in her hands. Shirley grits her teeth and narrows her eyes in anger. Her forehead is red with rage. The woman does not understand George's frivolity and irresponsibility at all. She tears the note into small pieces. Evening. A flock of birds circles over a small village in the mountains. Shirley and her son are standing near the house of a plump, gray-haired woman with a cute face. A tearful Shirley thanks her. The woman smiles. "No, what are you? It's not difficult for me to look after Brandon. He is a very sweet and good boy." Shirley says, reminding her son of the rules of politeness. Now it's time to say goodbye." A boy hugging his mother says, "Goodbye, Grandma Lindo." Shirley says it's time for them and smiles broadly at her beloved son. The woman asks Brandon, "Shall we go?" He happily agrees. "Yes." Linda, a brown-eyed old woman, looks at mother and son in silence for a few seconds. Suddenly, she grabs Shirley's shoulder. "Shirley, wait please." The woman turns to Linda. "Is something wrong?" Brandon also turns his head to the old woman's side. He wonders what Grandma Linda wants from his mom. Linda asks Shirley if she has had any news from her husband or at least about him. The woman's face suddenly becomes gloomy. She glares angrily at the old woman. Barely restraining herself from scowling at Linda, Shirley abruptly turns away from her and says, "No." Linda doesn't notice the woman's irritation, so she continues, "Why don't you go to the capital yourself? You need to learn something." Shirley's patience was wearing thin. The woman shouts, "Yes, of course, he's such a good husband and father as long as he doesn't drink and gamble, right?" Shirley turns her head to Linda and adds, "I broke up with George and you know it." A woman does not like that a woman puts pressure on her painfully and pokes her nose into none of her business. Brandon and his mother quickly leave. Shoes clatter on the roads. The woman notices that Brandon is pulling her arm. The boy is jumping up and down. He probably wants something. The child smiles at his mother and asks her to go faster. The woman does not understand what is happening and looks at her son with wide-open eyes. But then she realizes that the boy is just very active. That's why he behaves like that. Shirley looks at Brandon lovingly. "It's good that I have a son. I'm happy." Brandon opens his eyes wide and asks his mother, "Is he coming back?" Shirley begins to worry. "What? Do you want your father back?" It scares her a little. Brandon catches his mother's change in mood and thinks, he really does not want to disappoint his mother who treats him so well. In the end, the boy gathers his thoughts and says, "No, all I need is you, Mommy." The boy touches his mother's face. Shirley cheerfully replies that she too only needs him. She asks the boy a second time, "Shall we go home?" Brandon looks up at his mother and says, "Sure." Shirley is satisfied with her son's answer, but one of her hands is clenched into a fist for some reason. The woman and Brandon return home already when it is dark outside. Near their small but cozy cabin, Shirley sees 2 men and a white horse. The woman freezes in place. "Who is this in front of my house? What kind of white horse, and why is the nobleman here?" Shirley can't figure out what the hell is going on, what these people need from her, but she is not going to just stand there. The woman resolutely moves towards the uninvited guests. A fair-haired man standing by the horse hears footsteps and turns his head to Shirley. A man runs up to a woman, grabs her by the shoulders, and joyfully says, "Shirley, I came back a warrior." The shocked woman looks into the eyes of the fair-haired man, trying to understand who he is. George's yellow eyes sparkle and he smiles at the woman. Shirley finally recognizes that look. She opens her eyes wide with surprise and fear and says in a trembling voice, "George?" The fair-haired man does not seem to see what mood his wife is in. He happily says, Can you imagine, now I have my own castle? And yes, I became George Walter. Brandon calls his mother. George ignores his son. The man proudly says, I am now Baron George Walter. I am an aristocrat. Yes, the man is very proud of himself. Some time passes. Shirley and her husband are no longer outside. They must have gone inside. Only a man in a black suit is standing near the house. He strokes the horse. Then the man turns his head to the side without removing his hand from the noble animal. The stranger has graceful features and dark blue eyes. In the house, George is standing in the kitchen that once belonged to him. The wooden door leading to the room opens. Brandon peeks out from behind them. He stares with big green eyes at George, who has changed a lot. The boy looks a little scared. Maybe he didn't recognize his father. George instead squints cutely and yells, Brandon! The man is happy to see his son, but the boy quickly disappears behind the door, not reacting to his father's words. This upsets George. He does not understand his son's strange behavior. He does not understand at all why everyone in this house perceives him as a stranger. The man squints to the side. He sees an angry Shirley. The woman stands with her arms crossed over her chest and looks angrily at George. She doesn't like the fact that this ghoul is back in her life and Brandon's life. George realizes that he messed up but still tries to lighten the mood with a joke. What, still wearing those old rags? The woman replies angrily, all because someone left his family. The woman comes closer to George and looks into his eyes. The man says, if you go with me to the capital, you will dress much better. You know that I love you. George, like his wife, crosses his arms over his chest. The man flashes yellow eyes and smiles, trying to calm Shirley's anger. But the woman does not care about his philandering. You love me, but you left me. How to understand this? You haven't even written a line in 3 years, but you say you love me? George doesn't want to talk about it, so he turns his head to the side. A very good way to solve all problems is to bury your head in the sand and ignore them. The woman clenches her hands into fists and grits her teeth in rage. How dare this scumbag come here so late and not even answer her questions? George taps his fingers on the table. He is thinking about something. In the end, the fair-haired man with a smile on his face says, come to think of it, Brandon can become a baron. You are not going to continue to raise him in poverty, are you? Shirley pushes the man away from her. You didn't worry about your son all these years. I had to do it alone. But George is not as dull as it seems at first glance. He grabs Shirley's hand. The blonde grins evilly and tells the angry woman, even though you hate me, think carefully about this offer. Shirley finally manages to free her hand from the man's strong grip. She tells him not to touch her. She dislikes neither his presence nor his behavior. George immediately becomes sweet and calm. He throws his hands up and takes a few steps away from Shirley. He did not think that his wife would be so categorical. The man turns his head to Shirley and says, it's okay, I think you'll be mad if I stay here for the night. Shirley, you have to decide about our son. The blonde headed for the exit of the house. He opens the massive door that creaks loudly, threatening to scare someone, and finally says, think about this option. He's not that bad. Shirley is in no hurry to close the door behind the uninvited guest. She just stands on the threshold and looks after her poor husband. The woman is confused by all these events. Meanwhile, the fair-haired man approaches his horse, puts his hands on his back, and jumps into the saddle. True, he doesn't succeed at it right away. George's blue-eyed companion calls out to Shirley, Miss Walter. The woman narrows her eyes and shoots a murderous look at the one who dared to call her that. She explodes with anger. Good evening. My name is Shirley, and my husband left the family 3 years ago. Blue-eyed lowers his eyes. Shirley continues, so I don't have a husband, so don't call me Mrs. Walter. The man squints to the side, not wanting to look into the eyes of this angry woman. Then he pulls himself together, closes his eyes, and sighs. Mr. George needs his wife. Only next to her can he become a good and famous warrior. Shocked, Shirley stares at the man. She understands that George really left the family not to drink and party forever, but to become a warrior. But this, of course, does not justify him. The stranger waves his hand. Many have believed in Mr. George. They are moved by his story of love for his wife. The woman sighs tiredly and puts her hand to her forehead. So I still have to prove that I'm real? The man agrees and adds that Mr. George's patron is Count Leopard. The blonde, watching his companion's conversation with Shirley, is very angry. The man notices George's mood, but still decides to negotiate to the end. The Count wants Mr. Walter to bring his wife to the capital. The trust of people and authorities in your husband will increase. Shirley smiles slyly and exhales. She is very flattered that George is almost helpless without her. After 3 years of absence, he crawled here, asking Shirley for help. Blue-Eyed leaves Shirley and goes to George himself. He calms the horse, which does not want to ride the master. The fair-haired one is freaking out about it. He does not understand why this animal does not listen to him. After a few minutes, George, not without the help of his companion, of course, manages to climb onto the horse's back. Fair-haired and blue-eyed go on the road. Shirley leans her back against the cold stone wall. That's how you can catch a cold, but now the woman doesn't care much about it. She is angry with George. This is revealed by raised eyebrows and pursed lips. Shirley's expression turns serious. She reflects on George's proposal. I'm constantly thinking about Brandon's well-being. I don't want my son to be unhappy. But if I go back to George, my life will be hell. The next day. Still, Shirley agreed. That is why now, holding Brandon in her arms, she is sitting in the carriage opposite her husband, who is admiring the scenery outside the window. The woman also decides to observe nature. Suddenly she says to George, "You must keep your promise." The blonde makes a fool of himself. The woman sees this, but is not going to back down. Shirley emphatically declares, "I'll break up with you if you lied." George is quick to correct himself. "Don't worry, it won't take long." The man leans back relaxed on the back of a comfortable seat and turns his gaze to the window again. Blonde tells Shirley that everything is fine. These are only temporary difficulties. Shirley says nothing. She looks at the trees outside the window and thinks about something of her own. A wave of sadness covers her. It is difficult for her to leave her home village, although it is poor. The carriage keeps on going. Not too fast to make passengers feel comfortable and not too slow, just what is needed. Very soon, the family finds itself near a luxurious castle. They are met by a gray-haired, mustachioed man in a black suit. He smiles kindly at the guests. The carriage stops. The man waits patiently by the door for the arrivals to leave. He kindly holds the carriage door for Shirley. The woman carefully descends. Her simple black shoes clatter down the stairs. She walks carefully so as not to wake up a sleeping Brandon. The boy is still in her arms. A gray-haired man bows to the guest. "Glad to welcome you. I am the butler of this house." Shirley looks at the man with wide eyes. A woman who is used to life in a small village where everyone knows each other is a little frightened by strangers. The butler kindly says that he will show Shirley the way. George, who has also got out of the carriage, says, "First, let's order new clothes." The man groans, kneading his shoulders. The butler says that the master will arrive here soon. The fair-haired one glances at Shirley and mockingly says, "At least I'm ashamed you have the manners of a country girl." A woman incinerates a man with a look. George's great castle. There is a huge swimming pool near the building itself. Inside, the castle also looks good. Very expensive and refined. A huge jeweled chandelier hangs in the dining room. There are silver cutlery on the table. A fork, a spoon, and a knife. Shirley stares at them with wide eyes, unsure of what to do. The woman's hands, despite all the rules of etiquette, lie on the table. She is served a plate with cherries. A woman touches them with her hand, wanting to try them. She raises a finger to her lips. It's quite tasty. Shirley wants more. The butler clears his throat and turns to the woman. He apologizes and says that the housewife should not eat with her hands. Other people can see it. Shirley freezes in place with a juicy cherry berry in her hands. The woman looks at the butler in surprise. Then he looks at his food. Shirley thinks for a few seconds and pops the berry into her mouth. Dvoretsky is surprised that the woman ignored his remarks. Shirley puts her hand on the table and says, "I'm doing the way I'm used to. It would be funny if I acted like royalty. You don't have to pretend to be someone you're not." The butler gently tries to deny. The woman says that she understands everything. She puts her hand to her cheek and closes her eyes. The expression on her face is satisfied. Shirley likes sweet and fragrant berries. Suddenly, George's voice rang out from somewhere. "Shirley, where are you?" The blonde suddenly opens the door. He is wearing a white shirt with a light brown vest over it. The man's neck is wrapped in a red scarf. He taps his shoes on the floor. The blonde approaches Shirley and begins to speak quickly. "I have good news. Count Leopard recommended Teacher Carlton for you. You may not know it, but Carlton is a member of the Earl's family." Shirley puts a hand to her cheek and narrows her eyes ever so slightly. She doesn't really like the idea. She feels out of place. But she understands that she doesn't really have a choice. George clenches his hands into fists in joy. The man smiles and continues. It is a great honor for us. We need to thank the Count right now. Then the man shifts his gaze to Shirley's outfit. The blonde leans to the side and shouts, Shirley, why are you still in those rags? The woman calmly asks George what is wrong with him. The man presses his hands to his face and is horrified. Just don't tell me that all of Brandon's clothes are the same old and scary. Shirley says in her mind that the difference in people between the mouth and one place is obvious. George claps his hands. Shirley, how can you dress him like that? The man turns away from the woman and asks Shirley why she didn't take proper care of Brandon. Why didn't you buy him new clothes? Shirley narrows her eyes. She is once again convinced that George is an insolent asshole whose mouth pours abomination. He abandoned his family and now blames Shirley for not taking care of the child. The butler puts his hand to his chest, smiles faintly, and tells the blonde that his wife has her own affairs planned. George glares at the man. The fair-haired man turns to face him and explodes with anger. Butler, since when do you interfere in the conversations of your masters? The butler immediately apologizes. George raises a finger and continues to scold the man. You have to be careful, and quickly call the seamstress here. Shirley punches herself in the head after these words. She doesn't want to see anyone. After some time, the woman is unrecognizable. Her ears are decorated with interestingly shaped gold earrings with blue stones, and her hair is gathered in a neat hairstyle, secured with flowers. The housewife is dressed in a blue dress. Of course, a maid helped her with her wardrobe, and now a red-haired girl with green eyes is holding Shirley's hand so that she does not fall in a new, unusual outfit. But it cannot be avoided. The woman clings to the step and almost flies down. The maid picks her up at the last moment. The girl asks Shirley if she is okay, but gives an affirmative answer. Shirley smiles at the maid. The girl tells the woman that she is taking her to the living room so that nothing happens. Shirley thanks. A woman touches a round door handle with a hand wearing a white glove. Shirley enters the hall. Her gaze is determined, confident, and serious. George looks at his wife and says she looks like a lady now. The woman gives him a look full of contempt and hatred. The blonde annoys her a lot. Shirley doesn't show it, just snorts and turns her head away from George. The woman sits down on the sofa and, smiling sweetly, tells the maid that she can go now. George puts his hand to his chin and says cheerfully, "A woman should know how to choose her clothes and accessories. It is important." The blonde stands up. He squints and laughs. Then the man starts pacing the room back and forth. He says that now they must visit Viscount Carleton. Shirley looks at the man running in front of her. It gets on a woman's nerves. She tries her best to hold back, closing her eyes. Raised eyebrows also showed her mood. After all, the woman can't stand it. She puts her hands on her knees and leans forward sharply. Don't go back and forth. The head spins away from you. The man crosses his arms over his chest and angrily asks Shirley, how dare she say that to him? The woman stares at him and with a challenging look and voice asks, What? What did I say now? Suddenly the door opens. Someone decided to disturb the couple. A butler enters. He says that Viscount Carleton has arrived. George's eyes light up. He smiles and says, "Oh, bring him here." The butler hurries to fulfill the master's order. The door closes. The blonde approaches Shirley. He wasn't done talking to her yet, but he couldn't care less now. His wife must behave herself in the Viscount's presence. Shirley looks at the man looming over her and asks menacingly, "What do you want?" He pulls the woman by the arm and shouts, "What are you doing, Shirley? Get up, the Viscount is coming." The woman asks George to wait a second. She catches her dress on some bump in the floor and starts to fall. The woman opens her eyes wide and screams out of fear and anger at George. The blonde manages to catch her, but then falls to the floor with her. The door of the room opens in time. We can only hope that it is a butler. But no. This time the Viscount himself enters the hall, a black-haired, broad-shouldered man. He sees Churl and George lying on the floor. The man crosses his arms over his chest and jokingly says that the relationship between these two is very passionate. The Viscount continues to watch George and Shirley, who still haven't gotten up. It looks funny and at the same time very strange, even impolite of them. Finally, Walter, seeing the Viscount, quickly stood up. He didn't even pay attention to his wife lying on the floor. but instead just roughly pushed her away, hurting her. The girl fell even more because of this. The dress was completely tangled in her legs, and because of this she could not get up. Walter, with a smile and a faint sweat on his face that he tried to hide, bowed respectfully and greeted the guest. The fact that his wife was lying behind him, unable to get up, did not bother him at all. The man immediately offered his hand to Viscount and said that what he saw here was a simple misunderstanding. He frowned and was in no hurry to give his hand in greeting to the Baron. Instead, he simply walked around him and headed towards the girl lying on the floor. Walter's yellow eyes sparkled at this turn of events. He even resented such disrespect for him. However, Viscount was not at all concerned about the reaction of his interlocutor. He approached Shirley, closed his eyes, and bowed respectfully. His black hair fell over his face and it looked great. However, Shirley did not care at all about the man's appearance or his actions. She was angry because she could not get up, and some unfamiliar nobleman also stood over her. However, Viscount did not pay attention to the girl's anger, but quickly reached out and lifted her from the floor. They were a few centimeters away from each other. Shirley looked into the stranger's eyes with interest. She quickly pulled herself together and moved away from her husband. She said with undisguised anger that it was a simple misunderstanding. But Viscount replied with a smile that he understood the danger of the dress in which she was dressed. Shirley didn't expect this man to treat her well, so she was surprised, and her bright green eyes widened in surprise. Viscount looked at the girl with an unspoken question. He touched the blue brooch on his jacket as if to cool off from the hot gaze of this incomprehensible girl. She continued to stare at her husband in surprise. That black hair was so familiar to her. The man had already frowned and said, "Miss Walter, you are confusing me with that look. Don't stare at me like that." Sweat ran down his face. Shirley finally realized that it really wasn't nice to look at a stranger like that, so she quickly apologized, and she explained her behavior by the fact that her husband painfully reminded her of her mother. She swallowed nervously. Her mother could read and write well, and this was a rarity for rural areas. Her mother was a very beautiful woman with black hair and a kind smile, and she was incredibly smart. She sold her knowledge, teaching village children, and the family survived on the money she earned. Shirley still remembers her mother's pride as she taught others. However, her work was almost always interrupted by her father. He hated when his wife was engaged in science and forbade her to do so. School hated him even more for this. He organized pogroms in the house, scattered all of my mother's papers, called her names, and raised his hand at her. He hated it when people asked his wife to read or write something, and after the screams, he poured alcohol down his throat and screamed even more. Mom always had her little daughter Shirley with her in those moments. They cried together and waited for the man to finally go to sleep. He did not understand that his mother's science provided the only money for the family, for which he drank. The girl remembered these scenes from her childhood and looked painfully at the two men in the room. She swallowed nervously, but quickly pulled herself together. With a smile, she explained to Viscount that her mother also had the same black hair as his. He tensed up even more and tensed up. Walter looked at his wife with anger and horror. He quickly stood between her and the Viscount and shouted to stop. With fear, he began to explain that his wife had just arrived from the village, so she did not know anything about the rules of decency and behavior. Vicente looked at Walt with undisguised hatred. But he turned to his wife and ordered her to apologize immediately. She looked angrily at her husband and was ready to shout words of indignation. However, Viscount intervened in the conversation and said that the girl was not guilty of anything. Walter looked at the guest with incomprehension in his eyes, but he did not even look at the Baron. Instead, he sat down on the couch and offered the same with a smile to Shirley, who stood still fuming. The girl listened and sat down, although it was quite difficult for her to do this because the dress was confused with shoes. Viscount planned to continue their interrupted conversation. Scully looked at the floor, thoughts in her head getting tangled in some solid lump, and again Walter intervened in the conversation, who angrily shouted that if Shirley continued to talk nonsense, then Viscount would not be able to sleep. However, he only offered the Baron to leave them with Shirley right now. Walter did not understand and out of misunderstanding asked what Viscount meant. Sweat was running down his face, even more so because now he was being kicked out of the room of his own castle. Viscount looked at the confused Walter and said sarcastically that he should go to the Count, as usual, to hang around him and fulfill all his whims. Such words made Walter quite angry. He blushed all over and looked at the guest with hatred. What did he just allow himself? Vikant smiled. Fiasco! He managed to make this madman angry. Shirley looked at the scene in surprise. Her eyes narrowed. It turns out that Viscount Carlton hates George. The same man finally pulled himself together and said that he really had a meeting planned for today with Count Leopard. Shirley crossed her arms and advised her husband not to forget to wag his tail in front of the Earl. Viscount laughed. Angry George wanted to call his wife some kind of name. He even uttered, "Shirley, you—" But he stopped in time and covered his mouth with his hand, because he remembered Viscount in the room. The man angrily turned and headed out of the room. Finally, he cast a hateful look at Viscount and Shirley and left. The door slammed shut behind him. Viscount laughed loudly. He couldn't stop laughing at everything he saw and heard. Shirley kept her balance and wondered if her teacher really disliked George that much. After all, their relationship was obviously not friendly. He ironically replied that he also could not believe that his wife hated him. But she spread her hands and answered that he could see everything. Viscount picked up the bell and rang to summon the servants. The sound of the bell immediately spread through the room. Shirley did not understand why Viscount called. This surprised her, and she directly asked, to which the man stared at her in surprise. Suddenly, the door to the room opened and a maid came in. She asked what Mr. wanted. He politely asked for black tea. The woman replied that she would prepare everything now, and turned to Shirley asking if she wanted anything. She looked at Shirley with undisguised delight. She tensed up because she didn't understand anything. Sweat was running down her face. After all, she did not think that a servant could be called with a bell. In the village, that's what cattle are called. The maid was still waiting for an answer, so she pulled Shirley out of her thoughts. But for a moment she got angry because someone interrupted her thoughts. But she pulled herself together and confusedly answered that she was the same as Viscount. The maid replied that she would bring everything now. Shirley looked at Viscount in surprise and swallowed nervously. He smiled sweetly at her. The girl said that in the eyes of the nobles, they peasants are just some kind of cattle. Viscount did not expect this at all and exclaimed with surprise, "Madame!" But Shirley didn't even hear because she was in her thoughts. He repeated once more, and only then the girl turned to her interlocutor, wondering what he needed. Viscount said he understood. His words might not be appropriate now, but still he offered to set Shirley up with a good tailor. Just for her safety. The girl, of course, agreed and said that she would be very grateful for such help. However, she asked if Viscount could do this for her. She did not believe him, he thought. But in a second, with a smile on his face, he answered that he liked her. An extremely brave and interesting girl. Shirley was horrified to ask if this man had ever fallen in love with her. It also blocked this, but he laughed and calmed her silly guesses. However, this answer did not suit her either. The girl looked angrily at her interlocutor. Is he telling the truth? Viscount had already calmed down and calmly said that he definitely did not fall in love with Shirley, because it is generally indecent for him to behave like that on the first meeting. The girl looked at the man and thought with horror, what is wrong with him? Maybe he ate some wrong mushrooms today? Shirley looked at the Viscount in horror. She was no longer angry at a joke and showed with her whole appearance that her interlocutor's jokes were not successful at all, and now he could get in the nuts. The one with an innocent face turned to the girl and replied that he was just joking. And as if, the child asked, "It didn't work out very well?" Shirley snaps angrily that yes, he didn't quite get the joke. But the man crossed his arms and made a pitiful face. "I'm upset because I'm quite a popular man," he said. However, Shirley turned away and also crossed her arms, but angrily said that the main thing is not the appearance but the soul of a person. Viscount looked at the girl and said that he had not even thought about such thoughts of hers. Hearing this from her was something interesting for him. Suddenly, the door to the room creaks open. A maid came in with a teapot and sweets in her hands. She poured the hot drink into cups and invited the Viscount and Shirley to the table. The man lifted the cup to his lips, enjoying the hot steam coming from the fragrant tea. He said that Shirley is a madam who knows how to hit the sore spots. Such words angered the girl even more, and she looked with hatred at the Viscount and how he calmly drank his tea. Her face turned red with anger. However, she pulled herself together and decided to drink some tea as well to calm down a bit. However, as soon as she put the drink to her lips, she immediately spat it out. The Viscount asked her not to spit with a smile. She got burned and got angry again, no joke. Everything in her mouth hurt, so she tried to remedy the situation with a cookie, but no matter how much I tasted, nothing got better. Before that, The tea was extremely tasteless. She was indignant that she had not been warned about such a lousy taste of black tea. She still couldn't get over that taste and pain from the burn. However, the Viscount smiled and calmly said that he was not obliged to warn her. Moreover, he liked the taste of black tea. However, Shirley objected, saying that he could have at least hinted. The Viscount watched her behavior with calmness and interest. The man replied that he did not see anything wrong with the situation. Moreover, the girl quite deftly coped with this, in her opinion, tasteless tea. Well, not everything is so bad. The girl became even more angry and looked at her teacher with a look full of hatred. However, he calmly drank tea and did not pay any attention to the behavior of his interlocutor. He said that now he will tell a secret. Actually, many people write him love letters. Women admire him. Shirley rested her arm nonchalantly and replied that if the man had told her this information, it was obviously no longer a secret. However, he only winked at her and said that it was still a secret that should remain between them. He sat calmly with a cup in his hand and spoke to his charming interlocutor. Again, which is already once a day, she got angry and was going to start yelling at the man in front of her. It still seemed to her that he had eaten too many bad mushrooms. However, she cooled down a little and answered calmly with only a hint of sarcasm that she was a married woman. She was embarrassed to even talk about it. However, the man again, as always, calmly said that he knew this. She continued to say that she had a child on top of everything. The Viscount continued the sentence for the woman. He has a wonderful name, Brandon, and he is a wonderful child. Shirley got up and angrily asked why the Viscount kept messing with her and behaving like that. After all, it was not decent at all. Even the calm and balanced Viscount did not expect this. Out of shock, he spilled the tea he had only recently drunk. Shirley liked this turn of events and sat down with a proud expression on her face and repeated her husband's words, that he should not spit. He coughed loudly, trying to cover his mouth with his hand, but he immediately started laughing wildly. Tears even flowed from his eyes. He laughed louder and louder, trying to say at the time that he liked Shirley more and more. The girl demonstratively turned away and cut off that she was starting to hate her interlocutor. However, he looked at the girl with interest and kindness and told her not to worry. They have a lot in common, so they definitely cannot become enemies. However, Shirley thought he meant George, so she angrily exclaimed that she did not understand why the man hated him. But he has no right to flirt with her. She defiantly turned away again, showing a displeased look. Meanwhile, the Viscount got up from his seat. He came close to the girl and said that he wanted to seduce Baron Walter's wife, to break his fighting spirit. Shirley glared at the man. Take advantage of a wife who knows nothing, seriously. This is extremely mean. However, the Viscount calmly spread his hands and replied that he really wanted to do so. But now Shirley can forget about it. He changed his mind. I changed my mind immediately when I saw her. Therefore, he offered her cooperation. However, the girl maliciously blinked her eyes and flatly refused such an offer. The Viscount touched his neck nervously. A drop of sweat rolled down his face. He stood in front of Shirley and couldn't believe that she wouldn't even listen to him. But she carefully looked into his eyes and answered that she could still listen to him. And we will even help. But the Viscount must take care of his own revenge. She carelessly put down and took the tea from the table. The Viscount looked at her in surprise. He was shocked by the behavior of this girl. She didn't even bat an eye. She drank all the hot tea she didn't like in one gulp and showed the empty cup to her husband. She explained that if you want, you can handle everything, especially if you know what you are preparing for. For her, George is just such a person as this empty cup, and she knows well what can be expected from him. The girl got up. The Viscount was still looking at Walter's wife in surprise. He did not expect such behavior from him at all. It really shocked him. Shirley was about to leave, and finally told the shocked man that he could find his black tea and practice handling it at the same time. The door closed loudly behind her, and the Viscount continued to stand in the middle of the room, not understanding what had happened. Find your black tea and deal with it. He analyzed Shirley's fame and could not comprehend or understand anything. Suddenly his cheeks flushed. Meanwhile, Shirley was running along the spacious corridor of the castle. Finally, she reached her destination and quickly opened the heavy door to one of the rooms. There stood the maid, the butler, and her son. Everyone immediately turned to the girl. She immediately went to the side of the bed and fell on it. "I did it! I met him!" was spinning in her head. The maid asked how the first lesson in good manners came, while the butler was engaged in science with his son, not paying attention to women. Shirley, on the other hand, did not seem to notice the maid and thought that she was getting angrier. The woman nearby was already frightened by this behavior of her mistress. However, her thoughts were interrupted by her son, who drew a picture and showed it to his mother. There was a picture of a family of 4 people. He, mother, sister, and grandfather Caliph. The child explained his drawing and talked about it with delight. Shirley looked up with interest. The maid and the butler became emotional. They were happy that the boy even depicted them in his drawing. He was a very good child. Shirley smiled and praised the drawing. She hugged her son. However, suddenly the boy thought about something. He clenched his fists. His mother asked about the reason for such a change in mood. He asked if he could draw his dad and said that he was afraid. Shirley was not jokingly scared and angry at the same time. The boy stood and looked questioningly at his mother. His bright green eyes, like Shirley's, sparkled. They reflected only one question regarding the correctness of their actions and thoughts. Shirley looked at the child and did not know how to properly answer her son. She understood that he was too young and could not know and understand everything. Therefore, she simply came closer and took his shoulders. The girl lifted Brandon in her arms and answered that he can do whatever he wants. The boy exhaled and smiled at his mother. Shirley held her son in her arms and turned to the servant who was standing next to her. She said that she was going to take the child to the next lesson herself. The maid raised her eyebrows in surprise. However, her reaction quickly changed and she exclaimed with delight that this was a great idea. She loved the relationship between this sweet boy and his beautiful mother. They were extremely sincere, kind, and simple. Shirley smiled gratefully at the servant and headed for the door. Brandon was in her arms and she herself, with a tense look, was thinking about whether she should meet Vicent alone. Her bright green eyes narrowed. After all, despite her hatred for her husband, she does not want trouble, first of all, for the child. And that's really the problem. Street. A luxurious multi-story castle. The sun was shining in the yard and snow-white seagulls were circling around the majestic building. The sun reflected from the high towers of the castle. A blue-haired woman in a red skirt entered one of the rooms. They had suitcases in their hands and a butler came out to meet them. The man bowed respectfully and said that Madame was waiting for this guest and asked her to follow him. The woman moved forward, her low-heeled shoes bouncing off the floor and making a small sound that spread throughout the castle through the void in its walls. The butler and the guest approached the door of one of the rooms. The man knocked and informed Shirley, who was there, that a new seamstress had arrived. Shirley immediately invited to enter her room. The woman barely audibly opened the door with her foot and moved forward. "Welcome, Dorothy, I called you right?" Shirley greeted the guest with a smile on her face in a blue dress with pink roses. The charismatic seamstress replied that Shirley had called her correctly and smiled as well. This woman seemed modern and cheerful. Before Shirley could ask whether her dress was needed by the craftswoman, it was quickly taken off her and measurements began to be taken. She was even surprised at such speed. Still somewhat surprised, the girl, holding her hands in different directions, said that she would be happy if the clothes were made light and comfortable. Dorothy, holding the tape measure in her hands, smiled. "She will sew an outfit of free cut from her dress. Everything will be perfect." Shirley thanked her but asked if aristocrats wore similar clothes. After all, despite her reluctance, she needed to take care of her own image. However, the seamstress replied that the dress given to Shirley was too fancy for her and did not fit her. Therefore, it will change the situation for the better, so that it will be both beautiful and aristocratic, and convenient and easy, the girl thought. She touched her head. The maid even thought that she felt sick. The fact is that a few days ago, craftsmen were already working on the girl, and then George ordered to make her outfit expensive and bright. She had to look like a metropolitan noblewoman. Shirley, of course, didn't like it. She did not understand why clothes should be uncomfortable but beautiful, but without the ability to move freely. Then she was told that she did not understand fashion, and does not understand anything at all. That wasn't too nice to hear. Her corset was tied so tightly that she could not even breathe. The pain was indescribable. And now Shirley did not understand and was indignant why her tailor listened to her husband and forced her to endure such torment. Dorothy, while working on the dress, noticed that this girl was completely different from the Baron. Shirley turned and replied that she would take those words as a compliment. She laughed. The maid quickly and with delight in her eyes explained that it was, of course, a compliment. After all, everyone says that if life were at least half as Vicomte's, then the problems would disappear completely. The women looked at each other and agreed that the Viscount was indeed a very kind man. They smiled. Dorothy continued to work on the dress. However, Shirley intervened in their conversation, interrupting that she did not like the Viscount. She huffed outrageously, remembering the acquaintance and meeting with him. Dorothy replied that this was her opinion and she might even be so. However, one should not forget that Viscount is only the second child in the family. However, the maid did not stop talking about how beautiful that man was. Despite the fact that he is the second child in the family and cannot be an heir, he works a lot, and with pleasure for his country and family. Shirley turned in surprise. Is he really such an angel? And in general, he is a Viscount. He has a surname, but he cannot be an heir. The maid began to explain. She described in detail the family tree of the Viscount family. Carlton is the maiden name of Countess Leopard, and only the eldest son inherited his father's tutu. The woman asked if Shirley understood everything. She replied that now she understood everything. The maid also noted that the second son, Theodore, was given his mother's maiden name. Now Shirley finally understood what the maid meant. But despite everything, Carlton is a very kind and modest person. He is satisfied with his title and does not claim the title of father at all. Dorothy also listened intently, while simultaneously working on the dress. So Viscount Carlton is the son of Earl Leopard, Shirley thought. The seamstress and the maid looked at her with interest. She continued to think. After all, it turns out that the same Leopard is her husband's patron. The Viscount does not like George, and so he flirted with her, his wife. It was too difficult to realize and think about it. Shirley covered her head with her hands to cool off a bit. The maid and the seamstress looked at her worriedly. They did not understand what her behavior meant. Suddenly, an angry George burst into the room. Shirley angrily asked what was wrong with him again and what he wanted. The maid gave a surprised look, and Dorothy also became angry. However, George looked slowly around the room. The women stood and did not understand what he needed. It turns out that he did not like the fact that Shirley entrusted the dressmaker to a woman, not a man. After all, in his opinion, women were not capable of working with clothes. This made Dorothy explode. She angrily asked what he meant. Shirley also got angry, not for a joke, and the maid, realizing what was going to happen, got scared. The door behind George slammed loudly. He took Shirley's hand, but she quickly took it away. She angrily shouted that she was told not to touch her. Even his touch was disgusting to her, but George didn't care. He shouted angrily about what had happened between her and Viscount Carlton. It seemed that he would explode in anger. Shirley didn't understand what her obsessed husband meant, but she was terrified for a second. George kept demanding an answer to why Viscount Carlton wanted to be his wife's mentor. And why is he leaving the post of teacher? He asked to recommend another person as a teacher, but it turns out that the Viscount liked Shirley, so he agreed to make concessions. He saw her once in his life, and the man liked her immediately. George wanted to know what his wife was saying. He had already said before that they would divorce, and after that, Viscount Carlton will definitely treat her like cattle. George called Shirley a soulless animal, but she got even more angry. She knew it would be like that. He's out of his mind and making a scandal again. George told Shirley that she was being a cheapskate. The girl clenched the edges of her nightgown in her fist. However, she could not control herself, and with all her anger, she grabbed the collar of her hated husband. He did not expect this from her at all. Fragile Shirley pressed George against the wall. He was even scared. She ordered him to listen carefully to her now. Otherwise, it will be worse for him. Shirley was still holding George by the collar as he was pressed against the wall. He was not jokingly scared, but she was angry and determined. The girl angrily blurted out that now her hated husband was listening to her every word carefully. She knows very well that he cares only about her image, but not about her at all. The man swallowed nervously and with undisguised fear replied that it was all nonsense that she made up for herself. Sweat was dripping from his face. However, Shirley slyly asked if she could return home in that case. But of course George frowned and showed with all his appearance that this was impossible. The girl triumphantly exclaimed that if she returned to her village, he would find himself in a terrible situation. And she already knew this well. Shirley let her husband go. She used to walk in rags, so if rumors spread that he left his unfortunate wife alone in the village, she clapped her hands in victory and mostly looked at her hated husband. Her bright green eyes flashed. This is her total victory. At the end, in order to finish off George morally, she said that he would not be able to do anything to her. After all, then his beautiful life will come to an end. And what is he most afraid of? George gritted his teeth viciously and freed himself from his wife's grasp, but indifferently spread her hands while the man turned to the exit. However, it wasn't in her plans to let him go so quickly, and before he left, she exclaimed that it had nothing to do with Viscount Carleton. The man turned indifferently. He adjusted the bow on his suit and only laughed sarcastically. His foot angrily hit the floor, the sound echoing through the silence and emptiness of the room. The Baron turned, his yellow eyes flashing, his look once more majestic to hate and proud. He threatened Shirley, telling her to take care of herself. The sun came into the room. Bright rays reflected from the mirror hanging on the wall. Shirley was sitting in a new, already more comfortable outfit of the same blue with pink roses color, and thinking about something, looking down. The Viscount approached her, saying that the girl had already started to look better. There was a large red wound near his lip. To the compliment in her direction, Shirley replied that the Viscount's appearance had, on the contrary, become worse. In front of her was a plate with food, which she did not touch. Instead, she looked at the interlocutor with complete indifference. The same also calmly answered that his father ordered him a little. The man cleared his throat. The wound hurt him and caused him trouble. However, he tried not to show it in front of the girl. Shirley thought with surprise that the Count and his son had quarreled. And even to such a state, how could this happen? George's patron apparently has a difficult character. The Viscount watched Shirley's reaction with childish curiosity. Suddenly someone entered the room. The door opened loudly, bringing Shirley out of her thoughts. The maid was standing in the doorway with Brandon. The boy held onto the woman's dress and searched with interest for the familiar image of his mother. When he managed to catch his kindred soul with his eyes, he immediately smiled and ran to embrace the woman. She also rejoiced at the appearance of her son. The Viscount did not at first know how to behave in such a situation. He softly said that they had classes at all, and although sweat was running down his face, he tried to speak calmly. Shirley angrily said that she remembered. "And he can teach, are there any problems?" Her son was sitting in her arms, who saw the cookie and already glanced at it. However, the Viscount did not expect this at all and refused to teach the lesson under such conditions. Shirley is happy because she won again, said that he is obliged to teach the lesson. This was confirmed by the maid. The woman looked at the man with interest. He shouted something unintelligible, so the maid thought it was an order to bring something. However, the Viscount only asked her to add something to the tea. He gave a small vial with an incomprehensible content. The maid took it and replied that everything would be ready in a few minutes. The woman hastened to fulfill her duties. The Viscount resigned himself to the situation and even began to smile. Deciding to continue with the lesson, he leaned his elbow on the table and looked at Shirley and Brandon, who were sitting across from him, waiting. The boy was eating a cookie, and Shirley swallowed nervously. She walked around the room with her arms outstretched. Winston sat across from her with his legs crossed and his arms crossed, watching her walk. She had a book on her head, which at one point fell loudly to the floor. This made Shirley angry. She was about to start screaming that she would not continue this pointless task when the Viscount got up from his seat. The man picked up the book and reassuringly said that the girl just needs more practice, and everything will definitely work out. His voice really soothed, gave an opportunity to cool down. Shirley silently picked up the book, and although she did not stop getting angry and was overwhelmed by all kinds of emotions, she still decided not to give up and continue to study. Their lesson was interrupted for a second by Toy standing up and shouting that it was fun. He could do it too. The boy showed how well he can walk across the room. The Viscount praised the child for such a wonderful result. Shirley calmed down when she saw the baby. She smiled, put the book on her head, and also decided to walk again. At least try, this time with a smile. The Viscount looked at her thoughtfully. Something interesting occurred to him. He turned to the table where there was a white plate. He took it in his hands and presented it to Brandon, saying that it was for children. The boy did not immediately understand and looked at the man with interest. However, he quickly realized and put the plate on his head. He walked flawlessly across the room, the dishes didn't even move. And Shirley, seeing this scene with a book on her head, began to fall from shock. The Viscount looked at the boy and could not stop praising him. The kid was doing really well. Shirley also watched him in surprise. Brandon clapped his hands and with a sparkle in his bright green eyes said that it was fun, and he really liked it. He was a really kind and talented child. Suddenly, a maid came into the room. She brought tea and treats in a golden tea set. The Viscount suggested a break. The maid poured hot aromatic tea for everyone. He smelled really good. She also got sweets of unprecedented beauty. Shirley tiredly threw the book aside and said that the nobles were really special. There is so much to know and learn. She was already tired, but she must be patient. Brandon walked around the room with a plate and she tried to pull herself together before tea and tune in to her studies. The Viscount raised a cup of tea to his lips. Surprised, the girl asked how he could drink such an abomination, but the man offered to try. But she agreed and with her eyes closed brought the tea to her lips, expecting the terrible taste she had learned earlier. However, instead, she was so surprised because something extremely delicious spilled out of her mouth. The Viscount asked how she liked the tea brewed with berry leaves. Shirley could not even describe the emotions. She looked at the cup in amazement and said that it was flawless. She had never drunk something delicious in her life. The Viscount smiled and said that even she might like the taste of strong black tea, but if you add a few berry leaves to it. However, the girl interrupted that she could not drink black tea calmly. Her eyes flashed. She set the cup down on the table with a clatter. The girl crossed her arms and said that her teacher was too pushy, but he indifferently threw up his hands and replied that he always was and always will be. The man turned to Brandon with a smile and offered the child, who was already starting to get bored, to do something more fun. The boy took the plate off his head and clapped his hands with delight in his eyes and agreed. He was very interested in what this mysterious, but interesting, sincere, and kind man had prepared for him. The Viscount knelt before the child and said with a smile that the boy could call him Uncle Teddy. The child was delighted. Brandon immediately turned to his husband, Uncle Teddy. Shirley was very surprised by this. Her son was responding so well to the Viscount. This turn of events was definitely not part of her plans. The Viscount said they would dance now, and they will learn a dance called waltz. He took the child by the hands and began to show the movements. Surprisingly, everything was easy for the boy. Shirley asked with surprise what the Viscount was doing. She did not understand at all what was happening and what the man was aiming for. The same one circled the room with a happy child and did not notice anything around, not even Shirley's question, or pretended not to notice. The woman smiled, seeing how well these men get along at the same time. It looked extremely cute. They stopped when they saw that they were being watched. Brandon invited his mother to go to them. He held out his hand and waited for her to join. Shirley, on the other hand, succumbed to her son's persuasion and took them and the Viscount by the hand, forming a circle. She concentrated on repeating the movements, and a dance began to take shape. Well, what a waltz, thought Shirley. They circled the room and she loved it. Suddenly, behind the smile, she did not notice how the Viscount appeared next to her and how they circled together, not noticing anything and no one around. However, their beautiful dance was interrupted by a shout. "Shirley!" Shirley, Vicente, and little Brandon froze in the dance circle, turning in the direction from where the scream came. Actually, George entered the room and approached them with a determined gait. It was obvious that he was angry and was about to scream. However, no one even stirred except Wooliter himself. His face was even red with rage. An unkind light flashed in his yellow eyes and lightning of fury seemed to emanate from his body. George came even closer and was already gathering the words to express his indignation. He sharply and strongly took his wife's hand. Her eyes were spinning from such a grip because it was really very painful. The husband came closer to his wife and angrily began to shake her. He demanded an explanation of the situation. He didn't like what she was doing to the child and what was going on in that room. The boy was not jokingly scared and leaned against Viscount, who was the only safe haven for him. The man soothingly touched the child's head. He looked determinedly at George. He continued to get angry, and Viscount, on the other hand, soberly assessed the situation and formed words to protect Shirley and her child in his head. The man came up and took the girl from the Baron's painful grip. He said that he taught them to dance and there is nothing wrong with that. Viscount maliciously put his hand on George's, thus not giving him the opportunity to swing his arms in any way. He swallowed nervously. Shirley, watching this scene, turned to Brandon. She asked him to go to her room because she did not want the child to watch this misunderstanding and get injured. The woman turned to Bessie, the maid, and asked her to take her son. Despite the tension of the situation, she kept her composure and calmness, at least around the child. The servant followed the lady's order, took Brandon in her arms and left the room with him. She was also not jokingly scared. And the adults continued to sort things out. The maid asked if everything was all right and if nothing would happen to her mistress. She even offered to call for help. However, Shirley assured her that everything was fine and she left the room with the boy. George demanded that the Viscount leave the room. However, he was not even going to let him go, or let alone leave here. He said that his wife is his student, and he cannot tell how to teach him. Vicente tried to be calm despite his undisguised hatred for George. The man stood between him and Shirley. The girl looked at the Baron, showing by her appearance that she would not allow him to touch her and hurt her. Moreover, there is someone to stand up for her. However, Walter was not even going to give up so easily. His face was crimson with rage. He snapped that he couldn't do anything wrong to his wife, so Vicente had better leave the room. Shirley decided not to make the situation worse, so she turned to Viscount with a smile. She assured him that everything was fine, and he could go and leave her alone with her husband. At first, he did not want to listen to the girl, but he looked into her eyes and, realizing that she was sure, let go of the hand of the hated George. He complied with Shirley's request. He looked at them carefully again and let George know that if he laid even a finger on Shirley, he would be very sorry. Carlton turned his back on his enemy and headed for the exit. Walter gritted his teeth viciously. How he did not like all this. He rubbed his hand, which was starting to hurt from Viscount's strong grip, and cursed him along with his wife, who also went to the exit. The door behind them did not have time to close as Viscount froze for a second. I said goodbye that they would see each other tomorrow. He winked and left the room, but Shirley stopped him. She did not believe that the man would come to teach her again after what he had seen. But he replied that he must fulfill his duty, and nothing and no one will stop him. He smiled sincerely and fervently. Shirley also smiled and happily replied that she was looking forward to their meeting tomorrow. Viscount smiled sweetly, bowed respectfully, and left the room on that note. Shirley was surprised by his behavior, especially after what she had seen and heard. Besides, this man had just called her by her first name. This had never happened before, and it particularly surprised Shirley. She thought. However, she decided that it would be better for her to go to her room and rest. For today she is already tired enough and just wants to relax without any complicated thoughts. However, she will not be allowed to do this so quickly. An angry Shirley came from across the room. The girl froze in place. Walter was still there. She looked at him hatefully and tiredly. He was angry again and his face was red. The man shouted that he clearly explained how his wife should look. But she didn't seem to realize. However, he pulled himself together and calmly announced that he had news. Shirley indifferently crossed her arms over her chest and looked questioningly at the hated man. He replied that the Count had invited them to dinner. George looked at his wife no longer with malice, but rather with a banal look. Shirley laughed at the Baron's words. They were invited to dinner by a dying old man. Absurd and funny. Of course she didn't like it, and she didn't like George either. It was generally funny for her. However, the husband quickly ran up to his wife and covered her mouth with his hand, looking to see if anyone had heard what was said. Fear was reflected in his eyes. He said that Shirley had no right and would not talk like that again. He needed to get Brandon right now, and he told her to be ready. The luxurious castle sparkled in the rays of the daytime sun. Its blue towers were interrupted and sparkled. The Count's estate had a luxurious appearance. Inside, a Count and a woman were sitting at a table with a lot of food for different tastes. They laughed loudly. Shirley also sat at this table. She had a son in her arms. She watched the Count and everyone else with undisguised hatred. She was extremely disgusted to be in this company. There was really a lot on the table. The lot of food, hot cake, and everyone on a plate, alcohol, and everything was decorated with flowers. George's patron, Count Leopard, sat on the blue throne. He propped himself up on his elbow and studied Brandon. He was wearing a purple robe and gray hair. George took Shirley's son away in order to take him in, and thus impress the Earl. Only the child was not happy about this and needed to return her back to her mother. However, no one interfered with this. Brandon was led to Count Leopard and told to greet him as he had been taught before. The man looked questioningly at the child. Brandon stammered that it was a great honor for him to see the Count. The boy was afraid and sweat was running down his face. The Count looked at the child and said that the boy looked great. He patted his head and smiled kindly. Brandon did not like all this and looked longingly at his mother. Yet he had to stand here and exalt this stranger. Surely, Seeing the child's emotions, waved at the Count with undisguised hostility and waited for her child to be released. Finally, it happened, and the boy ran to his mother with tears. At that time, Count Leopard raised a glass of rosé wine. He thanked the people for finding time today and coming to such an old man for lunch. Everyone at the table laughed, especially laughing, waving, and trying to please the Count, of course, as always, George. Shirley didn't care. She was the only one who did not laugh but only hugged her child with relief. George didn't like that at all. The next day, Shirley and Vicent and little Brandon gathered in the room again for lessons. Birds were singing outside the window and the sun was shining. Shirley learned to put the cup on the table quietly. Vicent was pleased with her results, and she tiredly resented the importance and senselessness of this rule. Vicent replied that it is extremely important not to rattle the dishes in the noble world. This is etiquette. Brandon laughed, cookie in hand, and Shirley glared at her teacher. A maid came into the room. She announced that it was time for a nap. The woman took Brandon, who gladly went into her arms, and Shirley liked it. The girl sighed with relief and said that the lesson was over. Vicent can be free, he got up from his seat. He looked at Shirley and smiled. The man came close to her and spoke her name. She did not expect this and was not jokingly surprised. Vicent asked why they really shouldn't have an affair. He touched the girl's face and asked her about it in all seriousness. However, did he really love her? Or is it just part of the plan to wash her? Shirley was horrified by this turn of events. She did everything so that this would not happen, and now in front of her, a completely calm Vicent is talking about an affair. It was awful. She pushed her husband away from her and shouted that George had already decided to divorce her anyway. However, she did not look happy at all. Vicent asked with a smile if it was true. After all, if so, then their romance is all the more possible and there will be no problems in this. Shirley replied that she was not going to give her husband any guarantees, only that George said that their divorce would take place only after the death of Count Leopard. Vicent did not expect this at all. He looked at Shirley in surprise. How selfish, mean, and cunning her husband is. She didn't deny it, and it was uncomfortable for her to talk about it, however, no matter what. It's the truth. The girl froze. She apologized for speaking so casually about his father's death, but Vicent interrupted her and said that this was not the point. He seriously thought about something. Shirley impatiently asked what the matter was. She was too interested. After all, there is so much that is unclear in this story. Vicent replied with a smile that his father was not going to die so soon. And there will be problems in this. Shirley screamed in horror. Vicent explained that despite the Count's illness, he is being followed by 5 of the best doctors. Therefore, his death is definitely not possible soon. His father has been in this state for 3 years and will live for a long time. Shirley nervously stamped her foot. Vicent touched the door handle. He replied that Walter had cheated on his wife. She clenched her fists nervously and angrily, and was ready to run to deal with it and teach her hated husband. Only Vicent stopped her right in front of the door. However, she pushed him away and exclaimed that she had to deal with it. After all, it can't be so easy to let it all go. However, as usual, the level-headed Vicent asked what was white after Shirley had another argument with her husband. Actually, nothing new and nothing will change. However, the girl was determined and shouted that despite everything she would get a divorce. It simply cannot be otherwise. She will not tolerate it for so long. Vicent took the fragile but angry girl in his arms. She closed her eyes and didn't even pull away, but instead tried to cool down. Vicent said that he was so in love with Shirley that he was ready to help her with a divorce. The girl looked in front of her in surprise. Her bright green eyes widened in surprise. However, she cut off that she did not want to be an instrument of Vicent's revenge. It is completely pointless and she will not allow herself to be used. Vicent looked worriedly at the girl and asked if this was the only reason. However, she angrily exclaimed that this was the worst option, and what else could there be? However, the man took Shirley's small and fragile face in his hands, looked into her bright green eyes and said that he really liked her for no hidden reason. Only now Shirley was not going to put up with this confession. She pushed her husband away from her and hit him painfully. He even screamed out of surprise and rare pain. He fell to the floor in front of the girl and covered his contorted face with his hand. She did not even move an eye, but simply looked indifferently at his behavior. She shouted that she was not stupid enough to believe such things, and he will definitely not allow himself to be used for revenge. Shirley headed for the exit. Vicent still could not come to his senses after such a blow and such words of this girl. He continued to sit on the floor and hold his face in his hands. However, at the end he told Shirley that he would get what he wanted anyway, and no one can stop him. Meanwhile, a noticeable wound appeared on his face. Shirley was surprised by his words. She turned and could not believe what she heard. Did Carlton really mean what he just said? However, the man only handed the girl an invitation to tea from Countess Leopard. He smiled. A few days later, something interesting happened at Count Leopard's estate. Behind the butler's castle, two people were walking down a bright and spacious corridor. George and Shirley. The girl was indignant that George went with her because it was not necessary at all. This made her angry. But the man replied that he should congratulate the Countess, because she invited his wife to tea only thanks to his efforts. Finally, they came to the right room. The butler opened the door for the couple and invited them inside. The Countess was already waiting for them. Countess Elena Leopard sat in a luxurious blue dress and waited for the guests. She eyed them quizzically as they entered the room. George immediately went forward, and Shirley felt a little uncomfortable with this luxury and this attitude towards everyone around her. It was strange for her. George came up and kissed the Countess's hand. He thanked for this in his words undeserved invitation. The Countess looked at her husband indifferently and even with contempt. She removed her hand and ordered him to leave. George did not expect this at all and stood in front of the woman in a daze. He did not understand the nature of her behavior. Shirley was generally amused by this. Walter glared in their direction and turned back to the Countess. He awkwardly held his head and thanked her. He said that he would pick up his wife when he finished his business. Shirley glared at him, showing by her expression that she did not want to see him at all. They parted ways. Shirley, on the other hand, laughed at her husband in farewell and went to the Countess. But she has already started to like it. The door closed behind George and Shirley sat down next to the Countess. She looked around and asked if she was the only guest here. Elena answered with a smile that yes, she was the only one invited. They just need to talk. The woman radiated goodness towards Shirley. The girl couldn't even believe it. At that time, a maid came into the room with tea and sweets. Shirley took the cup and tried to be as polite as possible. The Countess started the conversation. She said she was aware of the divorce intentions of her husband's beloved pet, Shirley. The girl did not even expect such a thing, but the words were chosen exactly for the purpose. Shirley sipped her hot tea. The servant got worried and started helping the girl. However, she asked if it was Viscount who told the Countess such information. She didn't care about the pain from the burn. The Countess replied with a smile that it was Viscount, and she also asked what Shirley was going to do after the divorce. The girl replied that she was planning to return home, to which Elena nodded contemptuously. However, Shirley replied that she was not part of the capital's life, and her manners do not correspond to their society at all. She demonstrated this by spilling tea on a snow-white tablecloth. The Countess did the same, and 2 tea stains changed the color of the tablecloth. However, it did not bother her at all. The Countess replied with a smile that in that case, she would also forget about politeness and rules. Shirley was completely surprised. Elena crossed her arms and asked about Shirley's son's crush on Teddy. However, she replied that the 6-year-old boy just likes people who play with him, that's all. The girl was already tense. The Countess replied with a smile that it was better than if no one had played with it at all. The girl agreed, but the Countess did not let her finish but held out a purple scarf and offered to become Teddy's stepfather to her son. Shirley was absolutely stunned. She stood up and angrily exclaimed that it was absolutely nonsense to say such a thing to her. However, the girl quickly got over herself. I realized that the Countess had given her the handkerchief because she guessed about such a reaction. The woman was not even surprised. She just smiled and said she just wanted Shirley to be near her son.